The strange thing about money is that it can buy almost anything except the one thing Alexander Hayes suddenly wanted most. The check lay untouched on the table. $50,000. Enough to change someone's month. Maybe someone's year. Around it, the restaurant buzzed with the soft sounds of silverware, quiet conversations, and glasses clinking beneath warm amber lights. Yet all Alexander could see was the young waitress standing across from him. Claire Bennett looked down at the check for a moment, then gently slid it back across the polished wood. Her expression didn't change. No excitement. No disbelief. No gratitude. Just calm. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake." Alexander stared at her. People rarely return money, especially not that amount. "It's not a mistake," he said. "Keep it." Claire glanced at the number once more before offering a polite smile. "That's very generous, but I can't accept it." The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. At the neighboring tables, a few customers had begun to notice. Alexander wasn't accustomed to hearing that answer. In his world, money solved problems. It opened doors. It settled arguments. It turned impossible situations into manageable ones. Yet here was a waitress in a simple black uniform refusing more money than many people earned in months. "Why?" he asked. Claire folded her hands in front of her apron. "Because I didn't do anything that deserves $50,000. Her voice was soft, not defensive, not proud, simply honest. Alexander leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, he stopped checking his phone. Outside, rain tapped gently against the restaurant windows. Inside, Claire remained perfectly composed beneath the warm glow of the hanging lights. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to make a point. She genuinely meant what she said. "Most people would take it," Alexander replied. "Maybe," Claire said, "but I'm not most people." Then she picked up the check and placed it beside his coffee cup. A simple gesture, yet somehow it unsettled him more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. Claire excused herself and moved on to another table. Within seconds, she was helping an elderly couple decide between two desserts. Smiling, listening, treating them exactly the same way she had treated the billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers across the country. Alexander watched her walk away. Something about her felt different. Not mysterious, not dramatic, different in a quieter way, as if she carried a kind of peace he had spent years searching for without realizing it. He glanced at his Swiss watch. Nearly 9 o'clock. Normally, he would already be heading to another meeting or reviewing quarterly reports in the back of a chauffeured car. Instead, he found himself staring at a waitress who had just returned $50,000 without hesitation. Across the room, Claire laughed softly at something a customer said. The sound barely reached him, yet somehow it lingered. Alexander looked down at the untouched check, then back at Claire. For reasons he couldn't explain, the number on the paper suddenly seemed far less valuable than the woman who had refused it. And that was the moment the thought first entered his mind. A thought that would follow him long after he left the restaurant that night. Who was Claire Bennett, and why was she the only person in years who seemed to want absolutely nothing from him? The restaurant finally closed just after 10. One by one, the lights above the dining room dimmed until only the warm glow above the counter remained. Claire Bennett moved quietly through the silence, wiping tables, stacking menus, and straightening chairs with the same care she had shown every customer throughout the evening. Outside, the rain had stopped. Small drops still clung to the glass, catching reflections from passing headlights. Most of the staff hurried home as soon as their shifts ended, eager to escape another long day. Claire stayed behind a little longer. She always did. Not because anyone asked her to, simply because she liked leaving things better than she found them. A few minutes later, she stepped outside carrying a worn navy umbrella and a canvas tote bag. The cold Manhattan air brushed against her cheeks. Across the street, a luxury sedan remained parked beneath a street lamp. Inside, Alexander Hayes sat in the back seat, staring through the window. His driver had asked twice whether they should leave. Both times Alexander had said no. He watched as Claire walked past expensive storefronts and busy intersections without ever noticing the car behind her. There was no waiting ride, no private driver, no hidden luxury. She walked 3 blocks before stopping at a small neighborhood grocery store. Alexander checked his watch. It was nearly 10:30. Curiosity kept him seated. Through the store window, he saw her comparing prices, placing only a few items into a basket. Bread, soup, milk, fresh fruit, nothing more. 20 minutes later, she continued walking. Not toward an upscale apartment tower. Not toward a fashionable neighborhood. She eventually reached an older brick building tucked between two aging storefronts. The kind of building most successful people passed every day without seeing. Claire climbed the steps carrying her groceries and disappeared inside. Alexander remained still. The image did not fit the story his mind wanted to create. He had met people who pretended to be humble. He had met people who carefully crafted an image of simplicity. But there had been no audience tonight. No cameras. No opportunity for admiration. Claire had been exactly the same person when nobody was watching. Meanwhile, 3 floors above the street, Claire unlocked a small apartment door. The scent of herbal tea greeted her immediately. A lamp glowed softly beside the couch. An older woman sat reading beneath a knitted blanket. Her silver hair framed a gentle face marked by years of resilience. "You are home late," her mother said with a smile. Claire laughed softly and placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. "Busy night." "Good night." Claire paused for a moment. The image of the $50,000 check flashed through her mind. Then she smiled. "Strange night." Her mother nodded as if that answer explained everything. The apartment was modest. The furniture was old. The wallpaper showed signs of age. Yet the room felt warm in a way many mansions never could. Claire prepared tea while her mother spoke about a book she had finished that afternoon. Their conversation was simple, comfortable, familiar, miles away from corporate boardrooms and private jets. As Alexander's car finally pulled away from the curb, he found himself thinking about something he had not considered in years. Success had taught him how to acquire almost anything. But sitting alone in the back of that luxury sedan, he could not shake the feeling that Claire Bennett possessed something far more valuable than wealth. And for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no idea how to obtain it. The next morning began like most mornings in Alexander Hayes's world. Manhattan stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, wrapped in pale sunlight and endless motion. Ferries crossed the river. Yellow taxis flowed through the streets below. Markets opened. Deals were negotiated. Fortunes moved from one account to another before most people finished breakfast. Yet Alexander barely noticed any of it. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside him as he stared at the skyline. His thoughts kept returning to a small apartment, a worn umbrella, and a waitress who had refused $50,000 without a second thought. His phone vibrated. Then again. Messages from executives, investors, advisors, people waiting for decisions only he could make. Normally, he thrived in that environment. Today, every conversation felt strangely distant. During a board meeting later that morning, the chief financial officer presented projections for a major acquisition. Charts filled a massive screen. Numbers climbed into the hundreds of millions. Around the polished conference table, executives listened carefully. Alexander usually noticed every detail, every weakness, every opportunity. But when the presentation ended, he realized he had not heard half of it. "Alexander," the chief financial officer asked cautiously, "what do you think?" He blinked. The room waited. 20 pairs of eyes focused on him. For a moment, he almost laughed. These people expected him to analyze a billion-dollar transaction, yet his mind was occupied by a woman who worked evening shifts in a neighborhood restaurant. "Looks fine," he said finally. "Continue due diligence." The meeting moved forward, but something felt off. By noon, even his assistant noticed. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked as she handed him a folder. "You canceled lunch and rescheduled 2 calls." Alexander looked up. "Did I? You never do that." He glanced toward the window again. Somewhere across the city, Claire was probably beginning another ordinary day. The thought arrived so naturally that it surprised him. He knew almost nothing about her. Yet he found himself wondering whether she had slept well, whether her mother was healthy, whether she ever worried about the future the way everyone else seemed to. Late that afternoon, Alexander attended a charity event hosted inside one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom. Guests wore designer clothing. Photographers moved through the crowd capturing smiles and handshakes. Conversations revolved around influence, investments, and social status. It was a world Alexander understood perfectly, a world he had spent years building. Yet standing among the guests, he suddenly noticed something unsettling. Nearly every interaction contained an unspoken transaction, a favor requested, a connection sought, an opportunity pursued. Everyone wanted something. Everyone except Claire. The realization settled heavily in his chest. For years he had assumed that was simply how the world worked. Give something, receive something. Every relationship balanced on invisible scales. But Claire had disrupted that belief without even trying. As the evening ended, Alexander stepped outside onto the hotel terrace. The city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. Cool air drifted across the rooftops. For the first time in years, he felt less certain about the life he had created. Then his gaze dropped to his watch. 7:30. The restaurant would be open. He stood there for several seconds before making a decision that felt strangely important. Not because he had business there. Not because he had questions. Simply because he wanted to see whether Claire Bennett was exactly the same person today as she had been yesterday. Deep down, he already suspected the answer. The bell above the restaurant door chimed softly as Alexander stepped inside. It was 7:43 in the evening. The familiar scent of coffee, fresh bread, and roasted herbs drifted through the air. Nothing about the place had changed since the night before. The lighting was still warm. The conversations were still quiet. The tables were still filled with ordinary people enjoying ordinary moments. Yet Alexander felt strangely aware of every detail. His eyes immediately searched the room. He found Claire near the back, carrying a tray toward a family seated by the window. She moved with the same calm confidence he remembered. No rush, no drama, just steady purpose. She had not seen him yet. Alexander chose a table near the center of the dining room and sat down. Within seconds, another server approached with a menu. He almost felt disappointed. The feeling surprised him. 5 minutes later, Claire finally noticed him. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Nothing more. She walked over carrying a small notepad. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes." Her voice sounded exactly the same as the night before. "Good evening, Claire. Back already?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I was hungry." Claire glanced toward the menu. "Then you came to the right place." Alexander found himself smiling back. The exchange was simple, but somehow easier than most conversations he had during an entire week. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "Honestly, please." "The tomato basil soup. The chef spent 3 hours complaining about it today, which usually means it turned out perfect." Alexander laughed unexpectedly. Claire laughed too, just for a second. Then she returned to her professional composure. "Soup and coffee?" she asked. "Sounds good." As she walked away, Alexander watched her greet another customer. Then another. What struck him was not her kindness. Plenty of people could be kind for a few minutes. It was her consistency. She treated everyone exactly the same. The retired couple near the entrance. The delivery driver grabbing takeout. The college students sharing one dessert. Nobody received more attention because of money. Nobody received less because they lacked it. 20 minutes later, Claire returned carrying his order. Steam rose gently from the bowl. The aroma filled the space between them. "Careful," she said. "It is hot." "Thank you." She started to leave when a small voice called from across the room. A young boy at a nearby table had accidentally dropped his fork. Before his exhausted mother could react, Claire bent down, picked it up, and returned moments later with a clean one. The boy smiled. Claire smiled back. Then she quietly continued working. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Alexander noticed the mother's expression afterward. Relief. Gratitude. The kind that came from feeling seen. He looked down at his soup. For years, he had measured value in numbers. Revenue. Assets. Market share. Yet sitting there tonight, he was beginning to suspect that some of the most valuable things a person could offer could never appear on a balance sheet. And as Claire moved through the restaurant, helping people in ways so small that most would never remember them, Alexander found himself wondering whether that was exactly why he could not stop thinking about her. Over the next week, something unusual happened. Alexander Hayes returned to the restaurant 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. At first he told himself it was because the food was good. Then he blamed convenience. After that, he stopped pretending. The truth was simpler. Claire Bennett had become the one part of his day he could not predict. On Thursday evening he arrived just after sunset. The city outside glowed with reflections from office towers and passing traffic. Inside, the restaurant felt warm and familiar. Claire was carrying a coffee pot when she noticed him entering. She offered the same polite smile she gave every customer. No excitement. No special treatment. No change at all. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes." "Alexander," he replied. "You keep saying that. Claire said lightly. And you keep ignoring it. Maybe I am hoping repetition works. Claire laughed softly. Maybe it does. She guided him to a table and handed him a menu, even though both of them knew he would probably order the same thing as before. As the evening passed, Alexander found himself watching less and noticing more. Claire remembered regular customers by name. She remembered who preferred extra lemon with tea. She remembered which elderly gentleman liked his soup slightly cooler before serving. She remembered birthdays, allergies, favorite desserts, and countless small details most people forgot within minutes. Yet she never acted as though any of it was extraordinary. To her, paying attention was simply another form of kindness. Later that evening, a tired delivery driver entered the restaurant carrying a soaked jacket from an unexpected rainstorm. He looked exhausted. Claire disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," she said. The man looked surprised. "You do not have to do that." "I know." She smiled. "That is why it is a gift." The driver thanked her and sat quietly near the window. Alexander watched the exchange without saying a word. It was another tiny moment. Another act that would never appear in a newspaper or social media post. Yet somehow those moments stayed with him more than headlines about billion-dollar mergers. When the dinner rush slowed, Claire stopped by his table. "You seem distracted tonight." Alexander looked up from his coffee. "Do I?" "A little." He considered answering honestly. "I am trying to understand something." "That sounds dangerous." "It probably is." Claire rested her order pad against her apron. "What are you trying to understand?" Alexander glanced around the room. "You make all of this look easy." Claire followed his gaze. "What part?" "Helping people. Caring about people. Remembering everyone." For a moment, she seemed genuinely puzzled. Then she shrugged. "Most people are carrying something heavy." "How do you know?" "Because everyone is." Her answer arrived without hesitation. Simple. Certain. Real. Claire glanced toward another table, needing assistance. "Excuse me." Then she walked away. Alexander remained seated long after she left. Her words lingered in his mind. Most people are carrying something heavy. In boardrooms, people hid it behind confidence. In luxury hotels, they hid it behind status. In expensive suits, private offices, and carefully practiced smiles. Yet somehow Claire saw through all of it. And the more Alexander learned about her, the more he realized that the mystery was no longer why she wanted nothing from him. The mystery was how someone with so little seemed capable of giving so much. The following Tuesday, rain drifted across Manhattan in a steady gray curtain. The city moved a little slower beneath the weather. Umbrellas filled the sidewalks. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. Inside the restaurant, however, warmth and conversation pushed the storm far into the background. Claire moved between tables carrying plates and coffee cups while soft music played overhead. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Alexander arrived. This time she seemed less surprised to see him. "Good evening," she said. "The usual table?" "You remembered." Claire tilted her head slightly. "You come here often enough now." The comment carried no judgment, only quiet amusement. Alexander sat down while Claire handed him a menu she knew he probably would not open. As she turned away, the restaurant door opened again. A thin older man stepped inside, his jacket damp from the rain. His shoes looked worn. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He hesitated near the entrance, as if unsure whether he belonged there. Several customers barely glanced up. Claire noticed immediately. She always noticed. Without drawing attention to herself, she approached him with a smile. "Table for one." The man nodded. Claire guided him to a small corner table near the window. A few minutes later, Alexander watched her carry over a bowl of soup and a sandwich. The man looked confused. "I only ordered coffee." Claire smiled gently. "The kitchen made extra." The man looked down at the meal before quietly thanking her. Alexander knew enough about business to recognize a fiction when he heard one. The restaurant had not made extra. Claire had simply chosen kindness over convenience. Again, an hour later, as the evening crowd began thinning, Alexander noticed something else. While clearing tables, Claire slipped an envelope into her tote bag. It was plain white and unmarked. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Yet shortly after her shift ended, curiosity persuaded him to remain nearby. He sat in his car across the street while rain tapped softly against the windows. 20 minutes later, Claire emerged carrying her umbrella and began walking. Instead of heading home, she turned toward a neighboring block. Alexander watched from a distance. She entered a modest apartment building and disappeared inside. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When she finally emerged, the envelope was gone. The next afternoon, unable to ignore his curiosity any longer, Alexander returned to the neighborhood. A small grocery store owner recognized Claire's photograph on his phone. "Claire Bennett," the man said. "Wonderful young lady. You know her?" Alexander asked. The owner nodded. "Every month, she helps an elderly widow in the building next door. Pays part of her grocery bill. Never tells anyone." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. How long has she been doing that? Almost 3 years. 3 years. 3 years of helping someone quietly while struggling with her own responsibilities. 3 years without recognition, without applause, without posting about it for the world to admire. That evening, Alexander stood alone beside the window of his office overlooking the city. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere among them was Claire. He thought about every charity gala he had attended, every public donation, every speech about generosity. Yet none of those memories affected him the way this one did. Because Claire was not helping people when it was convenient. She was helping people when nobody was watching. And for the first time, Alexander began to suspect that the greatest things a person could do were often the things nobody ever saw. For the next several days, Alexander tried to focus on work. He reviewed contracts, attended meetings, approved investments worth more money than most people could imagine. Yet Claire Bennett remained somewhere in the background of every thought. Not because she was trying to impress him. The opposite. She seemed completely unaware of the effect she was having on him. That was what made it impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Alexander sat in his office while a private research report rested unopened on his desk. Normally, he would have reviewed every page immediately. Information was power. Information reduced uncertainty. But this time he hesitated. The report contained details about Claire's life, education, employment history, financial records, everything his team had legally gathered through public sources. He stared at the folder for several minutes before finally opening it. The information surprised him, not because it revealed anything scandalous, because it revealed almost nothing at all. Claire had attended a respected university years earlier. Her grades had been exceptional. Professors had described her as brilliant, disciplined, and remarkably kind. Then, without warning, her academic path had ended. No graduate programs, no prestigious career, no corporate position. Instead, she had quietly disappeared into ordinary life. Alexander turned another page, then another. There were no luxury purchases, no unusual debts, no hidden relationships, no secret ambitions. The report felt strangely incomplete. It contained facts but not answers. That evening he arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Claire was arranging silverware when he entered. "You are becoming predictable," she said with a smile. "That sounds dangerous coming from you." "Why?" "Because you notice everything." Claire laughed softly. "Not everything." Alexander wanted to tell her she was wrong. She noticed far more than most people ever would. Instead, he ordered coffee and watched the restaurant gradually fill with customers. An hour later, a young woman entered carrying a toddler on her hip. The child looked tired and restless. The mother looked even more exhausted. Every table was occupied. Without hesitation, Claire disappeared into the back room and returned with crayons, paper, and a small coloring book. The child's face immediately brightened. The mother looked relieved. "Thank you," she whispered. Claire simply nodded and moved on. Another tiny moment. Another problem solved before anyone asked. Later, while paying his bill, Alexander finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind for days. "Can I ask you something?" Claire glanced up. "You usually do. Why are you still working here?" She seemed surprised. "What do you mean? You could be doing almost anything." Claire studied him quietly. Then she looked around the restaurant. At the customers talking over dinner. At the family sharing dessert. At the elderly couple sitting by the window. "Maybe I already am doing what I want to do." Her answer settled over the table like silence. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Most people spent their lives chasing something bigger. More money, more status, more recognition. Yet Claire spoke as though contentment was not a destination, as though she had already found it. Walking back to his car later that night, Alexander realized something unsettling. The more he learned about Claire Bennett, the less she fit into any category he understood. And for a man who had built an empire by understanding people, that mystery was becoming impossible to resist. 2 days later, Alexander made a decision. It seemed reasonable at first, practical, even generous. Through a private foundation, he quietly arranged assistance for the elderly widow Claire had been helping for years. Medical expenses, grocery support, property maintenance, everything handled anonymously. No publicity, no recognition. He told himself he was helping. Yet deep down, another truth existed. Part of him wanted to remove one burden from Claire's life. A week passed before he mentioned it. The restaurant was unusually quiet that evening. Rain tapped softly against the windows while jazz music drifted through the dining room. Claire set a cup of coffee in front of him and noticed something different in his expression. "You look pleased with yourself," she said. Alexander smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." He hesitated. Then he told her. Not every detail. Just enough. He explained that someone had stepped in to help the elderly woman from the neighboring building. That her expenses would be covered for years. That she would not have to worry anymore. Claire listened without interrupting. Her expression remained calm. When he finished speaking, she looked down at the table for several seconds. Alexander expected gratitude, relief, perhaps even happiness. Instead, she quietly asked, "Was it you?" The question caught him off guard. "Does it matter?" Claire lifted her eyes. "Yes." He sighed. "Yes, it was me." Silence settled between them. Not angry silence. Not disappointed silence. Something quieter. More thoughtful. Finally, Claire sat down across from him for the first time since they had met. "You were trying to help." "I was." "I know." Alexander waited. "But..." Claire folded her hands together. "Did you ever ask what she wanted?" He frowned slightly. "She needed help." "Yes." "Then what is wrong with helping?" Claire glanced toward the window where rain rolled down the glass. "Nothing is wrong with helping." Her voice remained gentle. "But sometimes people deserve the dignity of being part of the decision." Alexander felt the words land harder than he expected. "I do not understand." Claire nodded slowly. "Most people see a problem and immediately try to fix it. They mean well. But not every act of kindness begins with money." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes it begins with listening." Alexander looked down at his coffee. For years he had solved problems exactly that way. Quickly, efficiently, decisively. It was how he built companies, how he managed crises, how he changed lives. Yet sitting across from Claire, he realized something uncomfortable. He had never once considered asking the widow what she actually wanted. Claire stood and adjusted her apron. "She will appreciate the help," she said softly. "Please do not misunderstand me." "But..." Alexander asked again. Claire smiled. "You are learning that generosity and understanding are not always the same thing." Then she walked away to greet a newly arrived customer. Alexander remained alone at the table. Around him, conversations continued. Dishes clinked softly. The restaurant carried on as though nothing important had happened. Yet something had. For the first time, someone had challenged one of the beliefs he had built his entire life around. And the unsettling part was that Claire had done it without criticizing him, without embarrassing him, and without asking for anything in return. Once again, she had given him something valuable. Another lesson, another perspective, another reason he found himself thinking about her long after he left. The conversation stayed with Alexander for days. Generosity and understanding are not always the same thing. The sentence followed him through meetings, flights, and conference calls. He heard it while reviewing contracts. He heard it while standing before investors. He even heard it late at night when the city outside his penthouse had finally gone quiet. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. Because Claire had been right. Throughout his life, he had measured solutions by efficiency. If someone had a problem, he solved it. If an obstacle appeared, he removed it. It was how he built an empire. Yet he was beginning to understand that people were not business problems waiting for solutions. One evening, he arrived at the restaurant later than usual. The dinner rush was ending. Most tables sat empty beneath the warm lights. Claire was wiping down a booth near the back when she noticed him. "You are late," she said with a small smile. "I did not realize attendance was mandatory." "It is not." She placed a menu in front of him. "But some customers become part of the furniture." Alexander laughed. "That is not very flattering. The furniture here is reliable." For some reason, the comment made him happier than it should have. As Claire moved away, he noticed a man sitting alone near the window. The customer appeared to be in his late 50s. A worn jacket hung over the back of his chair. A notebook rested beside his untouched coffee. Every few minutes the man stared at a stack of papers and sighed. Claire eventually approached him. She did not rush. She did not interrupt. She simply stood beside the table and listened. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Alexander could not hear the conversation, but he watched the man's shoulders slowly relax. Whatever burden he had carried into the restaurant seemed lighter. When Claire returned, Alexander asked, "Who was that?" She glanced toward the window. "A teacher." He seemed upset. He was. What happened? Claire poured fresh coffee into his cup. His school is closing a community program he spent years building. Alexander frowned. Can anything be done? Maybe. Are you helping? Claire nodded. How? She smiled softly. I listened. Alexander almost objected. Listening sounded too simple, too small. Yet he remembered the expression on the man's face. The relief had been real. That is all, he asked. Sometimes people do not need answers immediately. Claire sat across from him for a brief moment. Sometimes they need to know someone cares enough to hear the whole story. Alexander looked down at the coffee swirling inside his cup. How many times had he interrupted people with solutions before understanding their struggles? How many conversations had he shortened because he assumed he already knew the answer? Claire stood as another customer entered. You know, she said quietly, most people remember how you make them feel long before they remember what you did for them. Then she walked away. Alexander watched her greet the new customer with the same kindness she offered everyone else. And for the first time, he realized that Claire was teaching him something far more valuable than generosity. She was teaching him how to truly see people. Autumn settled deeper over the city. The trees lining the avenues had begun turning gold and amber, and cooler air followed people through every revolving door in Manhattan. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander found himself thinking about Claire long before the restaurant opened. He was standing in his office reviewing quarterly reports when his attention drifted toward the folder that still sat inside a locked drawer. The research report, the one he had never fully finished reading. For weeks, he had resisted looking deeper into Claire's past. It felt intrusive, unfair, yet curiosity finally won. He opened the drawer and began reading. What he discovered left him silent. Years earlier, Claire Bennett had graduated near the top of her university class. Professors had recommended her for competitive fellowships. Several organizations had offered promising career opportunities. One recommendation letter described her as one of the most gifted students they had encountered in a decade. Alexander read the sentence twice, then 3 times. The report continued. Shortly after graduation, Claire's mother had developed serious health complications. Medical appointments multiplied. Expenses increased. Opportunities disappeared. Within a year, Claire had declined every prestigious offer placed in front of her. Instead of pursuing the future everyone expected, she chose stability. She found work, paid bills, cared for her mother. Quietly, without complaint, Alexander leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, helicopters crossed the skyline and sunlight reflected from glass towers. Yet none of it held his attention. He thought about the people he knew. Ambitious executives, investors, entrepreneurs. Most would have viewed such a decision as a sacrifice. Some might have called it a mistake. Claire had never mentioned it once. That evening he arrived at the restaurant carrying a weight he could not quite explain. Claire greeted him as usual. Warm, calm, unchanged. You look thoughtful, she said while pouring coffee. Maybe I am. That sounds serious. Alexander looked at her for a moment. Can I ask you something personal? Claire considered the question before nodding. You can ask. Will you answer? That depends on the question. A faint smile appeared between them. Alexander glanced down at the steam rising from his cup. Do you ever regret the things you gave up? For the first time in weeks, Claire did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window where evening shadows stretched across the sidewalk. Sometimes, she admitted softly. Really? She nodded. I am human. Alexander waited. There were dreams I thought would happen. Places I imagined going. Things I wanted to accomplish. Her voice remained steady. No bitterness. No sadness. Just honesty. But life does not always ask what we planned. And you are okay with that. Claire smiled gently. Some days are easier than others. Then she looked directly at him. But loving someone is not losing your future. The words settled quietly between them. It is choosing what matters most. Alexander felt something shift inside him. Every success he had achieved had come from pursuing more. More growth. More opportunity. More achievement. Yet Claire had measured her life differently, not by what she gained, by what she was willing to give. As she returned to work, Alexander watched her move through the restaurant once again. The same waitress, the same smile, the same simple uniform. Yet now he understood something he had missed before. Claire Bennett had never ended up here because she lacked potential. She was here because she had chosen someone else's well-being over her own ambitions. And somehow that made her far more remarkable than anyone he had ever met. Several days passed before Alexander finally asked the question that had been quietly growing inside him for weeks. It happened on a calm Thursday evening. The restaurant was nearly empty. A soft golden light filled the room, and the usual sounds of dinner service had faded into a comfortable hush. Outside, the city moved beneath a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset. Inside, Claire was refilling coffee cups and straightening tables before the late-night crowd arrived. Alexander sat at his usual table near the center of the dining room. His coffee had long gone cold. He barely noticed. Claire approached carrying a fresh pot. "You have not touched your coffee in 20 minutes, she said. "That cannot be a good sign." Alexander smiled faintly. "Maybe I am distracted. That seems to be happening more often lately." She poured a fresh cup and prepared to leave, but something in his expression stopped her. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked down at the steam rising from the cup. For the first time since meeting her, he found himself uncertain. In business, uncertainty rarely lasted long. Numbers gave answers. Markets gave signals. Data revealed patterns. But Claire was different. She never fit the patterns. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated, then finally spoke the question that had followed him through countless nights. "Why do you never ask for anything?" Claire blinked once. The question seemed to surprise her. "What do you mean? You help people constantly. You take care of your mother. You support others even when your own life is not easy. Yet you never ask anyone for anything." Claire studied him quietly. The restaurant seemed unusually still. Even the music felt distant. "Is that what has been bothering you?" she asked. "A little." A small smile touched her lips. Then it faded. "Because asking is not always the point." Alexander frowned slightly. "I do not understand." Claire pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Most people believe kindness is an exchange," she said softly. "You give something. You expect something back." Alexander listened. But the moment kindness becomes a transaction, it changes." She glanced toward the window where city lights had begun appearing one by one. "If I help someone because I expect a reward, then I am not really helping them. I am helping myself." The words settled over him. Simple, quiet, impossible to ignore. Claire continued. "That does not mean people should never accept help. Everyone needs help sometimes. But I try not to measure people by what they can give me." Alexander lowered his gaze. For years, nearly every relationship around him had been built on exchange. Access for opportunity, time for influence, favors for favors. Even generosity often carried invisible expectations. Yet Claire seemed to exist outside that system entirely. "And you never feel disappointed?" he asked. "When people do not notice?" Claire smiled gently. "The people who matter usually do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Besides, the best things in life were never things I could ask for anyway." Alexander looked at her across the table, at the calm in her eyes, at the certainty in her voice. And suddenly he understood why no amount of money had ever impressed her. Claire Bennett had built her life around values that could not be purchased, negotiated, or acquired. They could only be lived. And in that moment, Alexander realized he had spent years searching for fulfillment in places where it could never be found. The conversation ended, but its impact did not. Long after Claire returned to work that evening, Alexander remained seated at the same table. Around him, customers came and went. Coffee cups were filled and cleared away. The city outside grew darker as thousands of lights illuminated the skyline. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on a single realization. For most of his life, he had measured success by accumulation. More companies, more influence, more achievements, more recognition. Every goal led to another goal waiting beyond it. Every victory created a new mountain to climb. He had spent years moving forward without ever asking where he was actually going. Claire had done something no executive, advisor, or business partner had ever managed to do. She had made him stop. The following week brought one of the largest opportunities of his career. A major international partnership sat on the verge of approval. Financial analysts predicted enormous growth. Investors were enthusiastic. News outlets were already speculating about the announcement. Under normal circumstances, Alexander would have been consumed by the details. Instead, he found himself paying attention to different things. During meetings, he listened more carefully. He interrupted less often. He asked questions he had never asked before. Not about numbers. About people. One afternoon, a junior employee entered his office to present a proposal. The young man appeared nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he organized his notes. In the past, Alexander would have focused immediately on weaknesses in the presentation. This time he remembered something Claire once said. Most people are carrying something heavy. So instead of rushing forward, he listened. Really listened. When the meeting ended, he learned the employee had been caring for an ill family member while working full-time. Suddenly, the small mistakes in the presentation seemed far less important than the determination it took to show up every day. Later that evening, Alexander visited the restaurant again. Claire noticed something different almost immediately. "You look lighter," she said while placing a coffee cup on the table. Lighter. Less rushed. Alexander considered the observation. "Maybe I am." Claire smiled. "That is good. You seem pleased." "I am." He looked at her curiously. "Why?" Claire glanced around the dining room before answering. "Because some people spend their entire lives chasing things without realizing they are running." The statement felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Yet instead of resisting it, Alexander nodded. For once, he understood exactly what she meant. A few moments later, Claire excused herself to help another customer. Alexander watched her move across the room. The same calm presence. The same quiet kindness. The same person she had been from the beginning. Yet something had changed. Not in Claire. In him. For the first time in years, he no longer felt the need to impress someone. He no longer wanted to earn admiration through wealth, influence, or success. When he looked at Claire now, he wanted something far simpler. He wanted to become the kind of person whose character mattered more than his accomplishments. And somewhere deep inside, Alexander understood that transformation had already begun. Winter arrived quietly. The first cold mornings settled over Manhattan, covering the city in silver light and long shadows. Life continued as it always had. Markets opened. Traffic filled the streets. Deals were negotiated in glass towers stretching above the skyline. Yet for Alexander Hayes, something fundamental had changed. Not because he had lost anything, because he had finally discovered what mattered. Several months after their first conversation, he found himself sitting in the restaurant once again. The same table. The same warm lights. The same familiar scent of coffee drifting through the room. Claire moved between tables with the calm confidence he had come to admire. Nothing about her seemed different. She was still kind without effort. Still attentive without seeking recognition. Still helping people in ways most would never notice. And somehow that made her extraordinary. Alexander watched as she stopped to speak with an elderly customer, then helped a young mother carry a stroller through the door. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Yet he understood now that a meaningful life was built from exactly those moments. When Claire finally approached his table, she smiled. "You are smiling again." Alexander laughed softly. Apparently that surprises people. Not anymore. She placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "You seem happier." He looked out the window for a moment. Snowflakes had begun drifting gently through the evening air. "I think I am." Claire nodded as though she had expected that answer all along. Good. There was no dramatic confession. No grand gesture. No life-changing announcement waiting around the corner. The truth was quieter than that. Over time, Alexander had stopped measuring every day by accomplishments and outcomes. He spent more time with people instead of projects. He listened more carefully. He noticed things he once overlooked. Employees spoke of a leader who seemed more present. Friends noticed he was no longer in such a hurry. Even his family commented that he felt different. Softer. More grounded. Claire never took credit for any of it. She never tried to teach him. Never tried to change him. She simply lived according to values she believed in. And somehow that had been enough. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander paid his bill and prepared to leave. Claire handed him the receipt. Their eyes met briefly, warmly, comfortably, like two people who understood something important without needing to explain it. "Take care, Alexander," she said. "You too, Claire." He stepped outside into the softly falling snow. Behind him, the restaurant glowed against the winter night like a small beacon of warmth in the middle of the city. For a moment, he stood there watching through the window. Claire was already helping another customer. Another conversation. Another act of quiet kindness. Exactly as she always had. Then Alexander smiled and turned toward home, because he finally understood something that had taken him years to learn. The rarest people are not the ones who demand attention. They are the ones whose character changes the people around them without ever asking for recognition. Claire Bennett never asked him for money. She never asked him for favors. She never asked him for anything at all. And perhaps that was exactly why she gave him something priceless. A better way to see the world. If this story reminded you of someone whose kindness quietly changed your life, perhaps take a moment to share their name below. And if stories like this speak to your heart, you are always welcome to join us again for another one. Because sometimes the most powerful people are the ones the world almost overlooks. And sometimes the quietest lessons stay with us the longest.